Welcome everyone for the first day of teachings on the Ornament of Liberation. The important thing in the Buddha Dharma is not to break the transmission. So once you start something, you should see it to the end. And what happens is that obstacles will arise in future. I've experienced this myself, and my own teacher also talks about this a lot. I'd rather have 5 people who are serious than 20 people who are careless. I chose to start these teachings on this date because it's part of the auspicious part of the Tibetan calendar. It's something called Sagadawa. It's in the Tibetan calendar anyway. It's supposed to be the date when the Buddha was born, achieved awakening, and achieved parinirvana. The Tibetans are very keen on interdependence, and they pay a lot of attention to these things. Ultimately, whether or not they're going to be beneficial for us is uncertain, but we have to try our best. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the biography of Gampopa. So we've got this Sonam Rinchen, who is the lineage holder through which we get these teachings. If you're familiar with the Tibetan system, then we are what is called the Karma Kagyu tradition, or likewise you could call that the Marpa Kagyu tradition. So this has got to do with the lineage of teachers. And at the top of this lineage was Marpa Lotsawa. He was the translator who brought most of the tantric material into Tibet. This is, around 1,000 years ago. And he had 4 principal students, but the really most significant one was a yogi called Milarepa. I think most people are familiar with Milarepa. He was he wore a white robe. He was a you could call it a lay practitioner. He was a ngakpa, a mantrist, not a monastic. And he thoroughly realized the teachings of the Tantras from Marpa, and especially the teachings on the Mahamudra. So that's the creation and completion stages. And his principal disciple was this person, this Sonam Rinchen, Lord Gampopa, who is a monastic. And quite famously then, he had said that his lineage holder would be a monastic and not a layperson like himself, because Milarepa had other students who wore these white robes of a householder. And as we know then in the Tibetan tradition, they're one of the main families, one of the main lineages. Sakya lineage is a family lineage. So to give you a bit of background on this, according to the Tibetan tradition, then the Buddha prophesied the coming of Gampopa. And it appears in the 36th chapter of the King of Meditation Sutras. So this is a sutra that many people will be familiar with. And the Tibetan tradition, then we associate this with Gampopa, being a prediction of Gampopa. And specifically within it, it does talk about how he would be reborn in the snowlands of the north. So there's an indication that obviously from India, if you go north to Himalayan mountains, that we'd be in the area of Tibet, Nepal. And so that kind of corroborates these facts. And from that particular sutra, now I have got a translation of the life story of Gampopa. It's quite extensive. We don't have time to go through it all, so I'm just going to highlight some points. I'm not able to share that translation with you because it's restricted. It's from our retreat center in Nepal, and it's not been officially released. If at some point I teach the life story, then we could get permission to do it. But I'm just going to go through a few main points. So what the Buddha taught was that in a previous eon, at a time when there was another Buddha, so a previous Buddha, then there was a bodhisattva in the Buddha's retinue. And this bodhisattva is the one that would be reborn in future as Gampopa. And so the extract we have from the King of Meditation Sutras talks about the life story of this Supushpuchandra. That was a bodhisattva. Now, I assume most people know what a bodhisattva is, but a bodhisattva, a noble bodhisattva, is someone who has achieved liberation on the bodhisattva path. And how they differ from an arhat, for example, is that they choose to be reborn in the mundane world to benefit beings. So their main goal is not to seek personal liberation or escape from samsara in something called nirvana. Instead, they choose to be reborn time and time again in order to liberate beings. And by liberating beings, what we are talking about is setting them on the path. So it's not through magical powers or blessings that bodhisattvas liberate beings. What they do is they teach them the Dharma, they change their way of thinking, and those individuals then enter the path themselves. And by entering the path themselves, making that decision themselves and applying themselves to the path, then these individuals progress closer and closer towards their own awakening. So the story is that this Supushpuchandra was in a kind of mountain hermitage and giving rise to all kinds of realization at one point, then decided it was time to go out and help others. So from that extract, it goes, Ananda, this is the Buddha talking to Ananda, his relative. The Dharma teacher, Supushpuchandra, went alone into isolation and stayed fully immersed in meditative equipoise. With his fully pure divine sight transcending that of humans, he perceived that billions of bodhisattvas who had developed the roots of virtue in a myriad Buddha realms had taken birth within this world. So they're talking about Jambudvipa, our own world, that has a history of previous Buddhas. So these other bodhisattvas who had perfected their qualities had taken birth within the human realm, our realm. And then it goes on to say, if they were to hear the Dharma of sacred formulas, they would proceed irreversibly towards unexcelled, true and complete awakening. If they did not come to hear this Dharma, they would face a reversal of unexcelled awakening. So what the Buddha was predicting was that what this Bodhisattva perceived was that there were many beings who were on the Bodhisattva path, and they were ripe to hear the teachings of this profound path. And so if they did get that opportunity, then they would excel and proceed quickly towards awakening. But if they did not, they would reverse. In other words, they would get worse. They would return to the mundane world. And so Supushpuchandra gave rise to this wish to go out and teach. And the problem is that at that time in I suppose you could say India or wherever it was in our world, then there was a great repression of spiritual teachers. So we have this king called Suryadatta, and he was kind of anti-religion or anti-Buddhism. And so many of these individuals were being kind of oppressed, and they were receiving bad treatment. And so the Bodhisattva, who decided he was going to go out and teach, then was discouraged by his followers or by his fellow meditators, because he said, if you go out, you're gonna encounter difficulties. They will harm you. Please don't go out and teach. And to this, then Supushpuchandra sang several verses, but amongst those there is one that says, the one who stays indifferent in times when the true Dharma of the Lord of men is crumbling has no honor, no respect for neither the victorious nor the bodhisattvas. So if someone stays silent in times of difficulty and does not teach, then that shows they have no respect for the Buddhas and bodhisattvas. And so then the Supushpuchandra went out into the world to find these beings who are ripe for hearing the Dharma and teach them the sublime path. And so as the story goes, then Supushpuchandra went out into the kingdom, and every time he went out, he would meet many, many beings, and he would introduce them into the Bodhisattva path. And these people, kind of impressed by his splendor and his excellence, would be encouraged onto the path. They would enter into the spiritual path. And in this way, he ensured that in future lifetimes they would be liberated from samsara. And this sort of, in the story it goes, he went out, he taught, many people were liberated, then he went back, etc. He did this many, many times. And so what was happening is more and more people within this kingdom of Suryadatta, this king Suryadatta was kind of an evil king, were disappearing. They were suddenly becoming spiritual practitioners, and his kingdom was becoming empty. And at one point, then Supushpuchandra had come on to the what we call the harem of the king. So all of his wives and brides. He had many, many children and many, many wives because he was a powerful king. And at one time, his wives who were all sort of relaxing in their harem, came across this bodhisattva, and they were so inspired that they decided to become renunciates and join the path. So, of course, then this king got pretty pissed off, right? Because he thought they're like stealing my whole kingdom and stealing my harem. And he noticed that more and more people were becoming loyal to this bodhisattva. And so he decided that he needed to punish this mendicant, this holy man. As Supushpuchandra was going out and converting people, there was fewer and fewer people who would be willing to harm a bodhisattva. They would see it as to be a very negative thing. So he had an executioner called Nandika. And he said to Nandika, "Oh, there's this terrible monk and he's stealing my brides out of his desire." He was making up stories, right? He was sort of gaslighting and making up these stories, disinformation in order to get the executioner to kill the bodhisattva. And of course, he didn't need to convince the executioner, because the executioner is somebody who relished killing. He really liked it. So upon hearing this, then Nandika, the executioner, raised the sharp sword and cut off the mendicant's hands and feet, and then cut off his ears and nose, gouged out both his eyes as well. So he cut him up into pieces, chopped him up into pieces, horribly, brutally murdered the bodhisattva, just as the bodhisattva's friends had predicted. But the problem is, because he was a realized being and a bodhisattva, then at the point where his arms and limbs were severed, then instead of blood spewing forth, what is said is that pure bright white light emanated from his body, and his body remained looking splendorous and beautiful. So when these miraculous signs arose, that this was actually not some kind of evil monk who was stealing his harem, but he's very angry. The king was very angry and wanted to punish him, but that he had actually killed this highly realized individual, then the king himself gave rise to great regret for his misdeed. So that's very brief. It's actually quite a long story. There's more detail in that. And this is said to be the previous incarnation of Gampopa, many eons ago, before he was born in Tibet. And as it says in the sutra, then he would be reborn in the land of snows in the north, and in a time of degeneration. So what it predicted is that at a time when this was needed, when a teacher was needed to come to the world, he would be reborn.